All right, so here we pick up with learning, and today we're going to talk about kind of just a little bit of the background of learning and then classical conditioning principles. So, like we talked about today, classical conditioning, there are multiple types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then what we call cognitive learning, which is what I refer to in class today as observational learning. Okay, so classical conditioning is involuntary responses, operant conditioning is voluntary responses, and then cognitive learning or the observational learning is kind of learning through imitation and observation, then versus actually doing the learning process. So, associative learning, which is kind of this umbrella of all of these things, at the core of this is classical conditioning. And how it works is after repeated exposure to two stimuli occurring in sequence, we start to associate those stimuli together. Okay, the result is we have a natural response to one stimulus now can be triggered by the new predictive stimulus. So, like we saw in the video clips we saw in class, when you pair something kind of that has no response with something that has a response, you start to condition that initial non-responsive thing to elicit the response. Okay, so for instance, stimulus 1 might be seeing lightning, stimulus 2 might be hearing thunder. Then here, our response to thunder becomes associated with lightning, and after repetition, just seeing lightning is enough to have us cover our ears to avoid the sound that we know is coming. Now, with operant conditioning, though, again, how it differs slightly is that the child associates the response, the behavior, with consequences. A child, in this example, learns to repeat behaviors, saying please, which are followed by desirable results, getting a cookie. And the child learns to avoid behaviors, yelling gimme, which were followed by undesirable results, which was scolding or loss of dessert. Okay, so one of the things to remember with operant conditioning is that the response occurs before the consequence. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail when we get to operant conditioning. Now, cognitive learning then refers to acquiring new behaviors and information mentally rather than by direct experience. So we observe events and the behaviors of others. We use language to acquire information about events experienced by others. So cognitive learning or observational learning is basically watching. All of this is this umbrella of this field called behaviorism, okay? And the term behaviorism was kind of coined by John B. Watson, and he was a proponent of classical conditioning, as well as by B.F. Skinner, who was a leader in research about operant conditioning. Okay, so Watson was classical conditioning, Skinner was operant conditioning, okay? It's really important to remember those two. Watson, classical, Skinner, operant. Both of them believed that the mental life was much less important than behavior as the foundation for science. And behaviorism actually was a huge part of psychology all the way up until probably the 70s, 80s, when we started to get a lot more focus on neuroscience and biology because of technology. Both foresaw applications in controlling human behavior. Skinner conceived of utopian communities where we can get anybody to do anything we wanted just by using these operant conditioning techniques. Watson went into advertising, and if you take a close look at advertising techniques, you're going to see that a large part of advertising is actually classical conditioning. So who started this all? Well, like the little story I read you today when I was spraying people in class, Ian Pavlov's discovery. Okay, while studying salivation in dogs, Ian Pavlov found that salivation from eating food was eventually triggered by what should have been a neutral stimulus, such as just seeing the food, seeing the dish, seeing the person who brought the food. And just hearing that person's footsteps. So all of a sudden these dogs were salivating at things that should not have elicited any kind of response from them. So before conditioning, okay, we have what's called a neutral stimulus, okay? So the definition of a neutral stimulus is a stimulus which does not trigger a response. So in the case of Pavlov, the neutral stimulus that he introduced was ringing a bell. So he would ring the bell, the dogs would have no salivation response. So it was neutral. So then what we have is an unconditioned stimulus and response. Okay, an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus which triggers a response naturally before or without any conditioning. Remember, conditioning is a fancy word for learning. So in the case of Watson, okay, the unconditioned stimulus was the food, okay, and the unconditioned response was the dog salivating. Okay, remember, conditioned, fancy word for learned. So an unlearned stimulus is food. An unlearned response is salivation. We don't have to be taught this. This is something that our body naturally does. It's this involuntary response that we're going for. Now, during the conditioning, during this process, you ring the bell, the neutral stimulus, and you pair it at the same time that you're presenting the food, the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so you have ringing bell, okay, at the same time as you bring the food, okay, which then is going to cause the dog to salivate, right? And then you repeat this process, okay? Multiple times. Now, after conditioning, the dog begins to salivate upon hearing the tone because our neutral stimulus becomes our conditioned stimulus, okay? And this is a really important thing to remember. The neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. Okay, so now after conditioning, we don't even need the food anymore. Okay, all we need is the bell. We ring the bell, which is now our conditioned stimulus, and the dog salivates, our conditioned response, our learned response. Okay, so did you follow the changes? The UR and the CR are the same response, okay, triggered by different events. The difference is whether conditioning was necessary for the response to happen. The neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are the same stimulus. The difference is whether the stimulus triggers the conditioned response, okay? So the UR and the CR are the same response. The NS and the CS are the same stimulus. Okay, so let's go through some other examples. Can you find the different responses in the following? Your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. The door to your house squeaks loudly when you open it. Soon your dog begins wagging its tail when the door squeaks. The nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," just before stabbing you with a needle. The next time you hear "this won't hurt," you cringe in fear. You have a meal at a fast food restaurant that causes food poisoning. The next time you see a sign for that restaurant, you feel nauseated. Okay, we'll go over these in class tomorrow to make sure that we can pick out and understand what all of these are. But these are some types of examples of things that you might see that you're going to have to identify the pieces of. Now, higher order conditioning. If the dog becomes conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell, can the dog be conditioned to salivate when a light flashes by associating it with the bell instead of the food? So what higher order conditioning kind of means is we build. So, food was our initial unconditioned stimulus. Now we have this conditioned stimulus, the bell. Can we layer it on? Can we add to it? Okay, and the answer is yes. A conditioned response can be transferred from the unconditioned stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, and then from there to another conditioned stimulus. So we can kind of build on all of our conditioning. Okay, this is what we refer to as higher order conditioning, turning an NS into a CS by associating it with another CS. Okay, so for instance, a man who was conditioned to associate joy with coffee could then learn to associate joy with a restaurant if he was served coffee there every time he walked into the restaurant. Okay, so it can piggyback on each other and we can build off of kind of our base conditioning. Now, acquisition. Okay, this term acquisition refers to the initial stage of learning and conditioning. So the acquisition is this pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. What gets acquired? Well, what gets acquired is the association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. And how can we tell that it has occurred? Well, our unconditioned response now gets triggered by a conditioned stimulus. The drooling now gets triggered by the bell. Now, timing is key. Okay, timing is very key. So for the association to be acquired, the neutral stimulus needs to be repeatedly appear before the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so again, this is key here. The neutral stimulus needs to repeatedly appear before the unconditioned stimulus. About a half second is ideal in most cases. The bell must come right before the food, or in the experiment in class today, Pavlov, water. Okay, the neutral stimulus had to come first. So what is extinction though? Well, the strength of a CR grows with conditioning. The more you condition, the more acquisition there is, the stronger the conditioning. Extinction refers to the diminishing of a conditioned response. If the unconditioned stimulus in the case of Pavlov food, stops appearing with the conditioned stimulus, bell, then the conditioned response starts to decrease. Okay, so if this conditioning is not continued, okay, then we definitely are going to start to see what we call extinction, which means that the conditioned response goes away. Now, there is something called spontaneous recovery, which is the return of the conditioned response. So after a conditioned response has been conditioned and then extinguished, following a rest period, presenting the tone alone might lead to a spontaneous recovery, a return of the conditioned response despite a lack of further conditioning. Okay, so if the tone or if the CS is again presented repeatedly without the US, then the CR becomes extinct again. Okay, so spontaneous recovery is kind of this instant kind of recovery of response, even though we might have been extinct before. Now, generalization and discrimination, okay, are two terms that we use in learning that you're going to see other places as well. But when referred to in terms of learning, okay, please notice the narrow psychological definition, okay? So Ian Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool when rubbed. They also drooled when scratched. Okay, so generalization refers to the tendency to have conditioned responses triggered by related stimuli. Okay, so in the learning, the conditioning scope, generalization means that similar stimuli is going to elicit a response. Okay, now discrimination, though, refers to the ability to learn only to respond to a specific stimuli, preventing generalization. Okay, so Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool at bells of a certain pitch. Slightly different pitches did not trigger the drool. They learned to just respond to the bell that was going to that had been paired to elicit the correct response. Okay, so generalization, you respond to similar stimuli. Discrimination is you learn to only respond to a specific one. So what's Pavlov's legacy? Well, insights about conditioning in general, insights about science, and then insights about specific applications. Okay, so Pavlov really did kind of open up this door into all of this realm of behaviorism that we studied and kind of was the focus of psychology for a really long time. All right, so we're going to end there for today, and in class we're going to talk about Watson and what he did with classical conditioning.